December 1939. A quiet English countryside, about 50 miles northwest of London. The small village of Bletchley lies under a cold mist, the sound of trains passing through on their way to the north. To anyone walking by, Bletchley Park looks like nothing more than a large Victorian mansion surrounded by gardens and hedges, a place for a wealthy family, or perhaps an old boarding school. But beyond the iron gates, the British government was assembling one of the most secret and critical operations of the entire war. The estate had been purchased just weeks before the outbreak of war by the Government Code and Cipher School, GC&CS, a branch of the British Intelligence Service. Officially, it didn't exist. Letters sent to Bletchley Park arrived under false postal addresses. The people working there were listed in army records as clerks, typists, or postal staff. In truth, it was the birthplace of modern computing, and the nerve center of Britain's code-breaking effort. The first to arrive were mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions. Men and women summoned with cryptic telegrams that said only, "Your country needs you, report to Station X." Among them was a young mathematician named Alan Turing, already known at Cambridge for his abstract theories about logic and machines. But there were others too: Dilly Knox, an eccentric classic scholar who had worked on German codes since World War I, Gordon Welchman, another Cambridge mind with a taste for structure and patterns, and hundreds of young recruits who didn't yet realize they were about to change the world. The house itself became the central hub, but the real work happened in hastily built wooden barracks scattered around the property. They were called huts. Each hut had its own function and atmosphere. Hut 4 handled German Navy signals. Hut 6 focused on Army and Air Force ciphers. Hut 8, Turing's domain, became the heart of the Enigma operation. The huts smelled of ink, cigarette smoke, and wet wool uniforms. Windows were sealed, doors constantly guarded, conversations stopped when anyone new entered. Inside, the atmosphere was both chaotic and methodical. Messages from British intercept stations, hundreds of encrypted German transmissions, arrived daily on teleprinters. Operators worked in silence, sorting messages by source, frequency, and content. Each cipher, each fragment of radio chatter, could hide the position of U-boats, Luftwaffe raids, or German troop movements. They worked day and night. Shifts blurred into each other. Many lived in nearby cottages or dormitories and rarely saw daylight. They weren't soldiers, but they lived under wartime conditions. Even their meals, cold sandwiches and tea, were served on rotation to avoid interruption. No one spoke of their work, not even to family. Every corridor echoed with typewriter keys and the hum of machines. Early mechanical devices built to assist the decoding process. The most advanced was a room-sized contraption of wires and rotating drums, a bomb, as they called it. It clicked and clattered endlessly, searching for patterns that could unlock the daily settings of the German Enigma machine. The people of Bletchley Park didn't carry rifles or fly planes. Their battlefield was the invisible war of information, fought in silence, in secrecy, and under relentless pressure. Each decrypted message meant lives saved. Each mistake could mean ships lost, convoys sunk, or cities bombed. By 1940, more than 7,000 people were working inside the estate, an army of intellect. Women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, university graduates, cryptographers, engineers, and even crossword enthusiasts recruited from newspaper contests. None of them knew the full picture. Each hut saw only its small piece of the puzzle. Only a handful of senior officers could connect the dots, and even they were overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they faced. Outside, Britain was fighting for survival. German bombers darkened the skies over London. The Blitz had begun. But inside Bletchley Park, behind blackout curtains and piles of intercepted messages, a quiet revolution was unfolding, the one that would turn the tide of war not with bullets, but with logic and electricity. It was here that modern intelligence was born. And soon, the race to build the world's first computer would begin, not for curiosity, not for science, but for war. Inside the quiet grounds of Bletchley Park, the real war was fought in silence. While bombs fell over London, another kind of explosion, made of logic, mathematics, and human genius, was happening behind locked doors. Every intercepted German message meant a new challenge, a new puzzle to break before dawn. The team knew that Enigma, the German encryption machine, wasn't just clever, it was diabolical. It used a series of rotating rotors, electrical circuits, and plugboard connections that changed with every keystroke. Each letter you pressed turned into another letter in an unpredictable way. With billions upon billions of possible combinations, breaking it by hand was practically impossible. Yet, the British refused to call it impossible. They called it just another problem. At the center of this intellectual battlefield stood a small group of visionaries. Mathematicians, linguists, engineers, each chosen not for military rank but for brilliance. Among them was Alan Turing, a quiet, eccentric genius with an unmatched mind for logic. His task: find a way to defeat a machine with another machine. They started with paper and pencils, trying to predict patterns in the endless streams of encrypted letters. The human brain, however brilliant, could not keep up with the sheer speed and complexity of the code. Time was their enemy. Each day a message went unread, soldiers died somewhere on the front. So, Turing proposed something radical: automation. Instead of men breaking codes, machines would. His idea led to the creation of the bomb, a mechanical device designed to test Enigma's endless configurations. It was massive, filled with whirring drums and snapping relays, spinning faster than any human mind could think. But even the bomb had its limit. As the Germans improved Enigma, adding more rotors, more daily settings, the British found themselves at the edge of defeat once more. They needed something beyond mechanical assistance. They needed something that could think. That's when engineer Tommy Flowers, a man from the Post Office Research Station, entered the scene. While Turing's logic laid the foundation, Flowers had something more audacious in mind: a machine that could process information electronically, using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical parts. When he first presented the idea, many doubted him. Tubes were fragile, unreliable, and expensive. But Flowers believed that if properly designed, they could outthink Enigma's endless permutations faster than anything else in existence. He wasn't just proposing a faster calculator. He was unknowingly inventing the first computer. While the world above raged with tanks and bombers, deep in the underground rooms of Bletchley Park, the future of technology was being born, not with explosions, but with flickering lights, wires, and the hum of circuits coming alive. The war was no longer just about who had the biggest army. It was about who could think faster. The idea was bold, almost unthinkable. Tommy Flowers, a modest engineer with grease-stained hands and a vision that outpaced his era, believed he could build a machine capable of reasoning faster than any human. A machine not of gears and levers, but of electricity itself. His colleagues thought he was mad. Vacuum tubes were known for burning out quickly. Most engineers wouldn't trust more than a dozen in a single device. Flowers proposed using over 2,000. It sounded like a recipe for disaster. But he saw something others didn't: speed. Electronic circuits could calculate in microseconds, not milliseconds. If it worked, it could read and analyze encrypted messages faster than any mechanical machine on Earth. He called his creation Colossus. Unlike the bomb, which attacked Enigma, Colossus was designed to crack a different and even more complex system: the Lorenz cipher. Used by the German High Command for top-secret communications, Lorenz was far superior to Enigma. Its messages weren't just coded, they were layered with digital chaos. Each transmission appeared as meaningless streams of characters, their true meaning buried beneath mathematical noise. To understand Lorenz, the British first needed to observe it in action. Operators at Bletchley Park listened carefully to radio frequencies, intercepting enemy signals day and night. One small mistake by a German operator, retransmitting the same message twice with a slight variation, provided the key. From that single human error, British cryptanalyst Bill Tutte deduced the structure of the Lorenz machine without ever having seen it. It was an astonishing feat of pure intellect. Now they needed a way to process the data Tutte uncovered, a task beyond the limits of human hands or the bomb's gears. That's where Flowers' Colossus stepped forward. He built it at the Post Office Research Station in Dollis Hill, working largely in secret. The machine filled an entire room, glowing with the warm orange light of 2,400 vacuum tubes. It was noisy, hot, and alive in a way no machine had ever been before. Long tapes fed through its readers at lightning speed, punching out patterns, testing hypotheses, rejecting impossibilities. Colossus didn't think in words, it thought in pulses of electricity. It could perform 5,000 calculations per second, a speed that made human analysts look like they were moving through molasses. When the first Colossus was delivered to Bletchley Park in December 1943, the war of intelligence changed forever. The operators, mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, fed messages into the machine and watched as the lights flickered like stars across a mechanical sky. Within hours, Colossus could crack what once took weeks. The results were immediate and devastating for the Germans. Thanks to Colossus, Allied commanders could read high-level Nazi communications almost in real time. They knew troop movements, attack plans, and supply routes before they even reached German generals in the field. Every hum of Colossus circuits brought victory closer. And yet, few knew it existed. The entire project was so secret that even Churchill himself barely grasped its scope. After the war, its creators were ordered to destroy it, smash the tubes, burn the plans, erase its existence from history. But Colossus had already done something irreversible. It had proven that machines could think in logic, paving the path toward the digital world we live in today. In the dimly lit war rooms of Bletchley Park, under the weight of silence and secrecy, the first computer had been born, not as a tool of convenience, but as a weapon of survival. When Colossus came online in early 1944, few outside Bletchley Park could comprehend its impact. The Allies suddenly possessed something the Germans didn't: the ability to see their enemies' thoughts before they acted. Each intercepted Lorenz message was like a window into the Nazi High Command's war room. Field Marshal Rommel's reports, Hitler's direct orders, supply chain discussions, even plans for troop reinforcement, all became accessible. For the first time in human history, a machine made invisible intelligence visible. What Colossus revealed wasn't just information, it was the rhythm of war itself. Analysts began to notice patterns. Predictable delays in message timing, repeated routing through specific command posts, the subtle linguistic habits of German typists. It was data on a scale never before seen. Before Colossus, deciphering a single Lorenz message took weeks of manual labor. Now, Colossus could process it in under 6 hours. And when more units were built, 10 by the war's end, Bletchley Park became an industrial factory of intelligence, churning out decrypted Nazi communications at a pace even Alan Turing hadn't imagined possible. This information flowed straight to Allied headquarters. Before D-Day, Colossus intercepted and decoded a stream of crucial German communications indicating that Hitler was convinced the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. That single misunderstanding, nurtured by Operation Fortitude's deception campaign, saved thousands of lives and allowed the Allies to land with the element of surprise. In another instance, decrypted Lorenz messages revealed the movement of German panzer divisions away from key defensive positions, confirming the perfect timing for the assault. Eisenhower's decision to proceed was backed not by guesswork, but by machine-calculated certainty. Every day, Colossus vacuum tubes glowed brighter, symbols of a new kind of warfare, electronic warfare. It was no longer about brute force alone, but about who could process information faster, who could think quicker, who could predict better. And yet, for all its brilliance, Colossus remained a ghost. Each operator at Bletchley Park signed the Official Secrets Act, binding them to silence. Even when families asked what they did during the war, they would simply smile and say, "Clerical work." The secrecy extended after the war. Churchill personally ordered that the machines be dismantled, their parts destroyed, and their blueprints burned. He feared that the knowledge could fall into Soviet hands, or that it might alter the delicate political balance of the post-war world. But not everyone obeyed. Dr. Tommy Flowers quietly salvaged key components and kept fragments of the design alive in his mind. He would later say that the destruction of Colossus was like burning the Magna Carta. Even though the world forgot, the consequences of Colossus never vanished. It demonstrated that data could win wars, proved that machines could amplify human intellect. It showed that code-breaking wasn't just a skill, it was a form of power. In the years that followed, whispers of Colossus would resurface in the laboratories of MIT, in the blueprints of IBM, and in the early designs of American digital computers. The age of human computation was over. The age of electronic intelligence had begun. When the war ended in May 1945, the people of Bletchley Park quietly celebrated, but their triumphs would never be spoken aloud. The machines that had outsmarted the Nazi war machine, decrypted the most sophisticated communications in history, and laid the groundwork for digital computation were now classified at the highest level. Colossus had changed the world, yet history was ordered to forget it. Winston Churchill, in one of his final wartime directives, commanded that all traces of the Colossus project be destroyed. He feared that knowledge of such a capability could spark new intelligence wars, or worse, give the Soviets a technological advantage. 10 Colossus machines were dismantled at Bletchley Park. Their vacuum tubes were stripped out, the chassis disassembled, and the blueprints burned in furnaces. The women and men who operated them, cryptanalysts, engineers, and mathematicians, were ordered into silence under the Official Secrets Act. Tommy Flowers, the man who had designed the first programmable electronic computer, was not even permitted to tell his peers what he had built. When he applied for funding after the war to develop electronic data systems, the British government rejected him, claiming his ideas were unproven. He couldn't tell them that he had already built and operated such a system in wartime. At the same time, across the Atlantic, American engineers like John Presper Eckert and John Mauchly were publicly celebrated for the creation of ENIAC, the so-called first electronic computer. ENIAC's announcement in 1946 was met with global headlines, "A machine that thinks." But those who had walked the halls of Bletchley Park knew the uncomfortable truth. Colossus had already done it, and had done it 2 years earlier. The secrecy surrounding Colossus meant that British computing would fall behind for decades. The mathematical breakthroughs of Alan Turing and the engineering genius of Flowers remained classified, while American institutions built on similar principles, vacuum tube logic, electronic switching, and parallel data handling, without ever knowing that their foundation had already been laid in wartime Britain. Meanwhile, the handful of Colossus machines that survived were quietly relocated to GCHQ Cheltenham, where they continued working into the early 1950s, decrypting Soviet traffic during the first years of the Cold War. Their operators were bound by even stricter secrecy. They performed miracles daily, and could never speak of them. For decades, historians wrote that computing began with ENIAC, and that wartime code-breaking relied solely on Turing's electromechanical bomb machine for the Enigma cipher. Colossus was missing from every textbook, every archive, every museum. Even the workers of Bletchley Park grew old believing that their creation had been erased forever. It wasn't until the 1970s that fragments of the truth began to surface. Former engineers, now elderly and freed from secrecy laws, began to tell cautious stories, of massive machines humming in dark rooms, of paper tapes racing through at lightning speed, of messages from Hitler's high command appearing in plain text after minutes of calculation. Then in the 1990s, declassification revealed the full scale of what had been achieved. Historians finally recognized that Colossus was not just a tool of war, It was the first step into the digital age. Yet even after its rediscovery, the tragedy of Colossus remained clear. The men and women who created it received no medals, no fame, and no mention in history books during their lifetimes. They had built the prototype of the modern world, and watched it vanish into secrecy. Only one original fragment survived. A small metal panel, salvaged by a Bletchley engineer, now displayed in the National Museum of Computing. Its worn labels, input, reset, power, are all that's left of a machine that once changed history. And so, the legacy of Colossus lives on not through recognition, but through its descendants, the computers, the code, and the very idea that information itself could be a weapon. When peace returned to Britain, Bletchley Park fell silent. The huts that had once pulsed with mathematical brilliance were empty, their wooden walls still smelling of oil, tobacco, and paper tape. Yet within those walls, the blueprint of the modern computer age had been born. And because it was a secret, the rest of the world had to rediscover it all over again. After the war, the secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park's operations wasn't merely a matter of national security, it shaped the entire trajectory of global technology. The scientists and engineers who had built Colossus and broken Lorenz codes were sworn to silence. They couldn't publish papers, file patents, or even mention their wartime work in job applications. Tommy Flowers returned to the General Post Office Research Station in Dollis Hill, the same place where he had built Colossus in secrecy. He applied for a government grant to continue developing electronic computing systems, explaining that he had proof of concept. The response came swiftly: "Your proposal is too speculative." Flowers couldn't say he had already built 10 working models. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the ENIAC project at the University of Pennsylvania was publicly unveiled in 1946 as the world's first programmable electronic computer. The British contribution was buried so deep in classified archives that even Alan Turing's role in modern computing remained underappreciated until decades later. The Cold War only deepened the silence. Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, the post-war successor to Bletchley Park, continued to rely on cryptography as a state secret. The techniques, mathematical theories, and even the knowledge of early computing architectures were guarded as top secret ultra. Some of the original Colossus operators, now middle-aged, were quietly recruited into GCHQ to help maintain cryptanalytic systems that would monitor Soviet transmissions. They worked with the same intensity as before, only now their task was to protect Britain from a new enemy. But the cost of secrecy was immense. Scientific progress slowed. By the 1950s, American universities and corporations had surged ahead in computing research. IBM, MIT, and Bell Labs were developing transistorized systems, digital memory, and programming languages, technologies that could have evolved faster if Britain's wartime advances had been shared with the global community. Even Alan Turing, the man often credited as the father of modern computing, struggled in this post-war silence. His groundbreaking ideas for the Automatic Computing Engine, ACE, at the National Physical Laboratory were hampered by bureaucratic caution and the lingering classification of his wartime work. Much of what he had theorized at Bletchley, about logic gates, data storage, and machine learning, was too closely tied to still-secret operations. The result was a strange paradox. The very people who had invented the foundations of the digital age were invisible. The British government's silence ensured that the United States became the public face of computing innovation, while those who had paved the way faded into quiet obscurity. It wasn't until 1975 that the story began to resurface. Historians and former operators, finally freed from the Official Secrets Act, started sharing fragments of their experiences. The first to speak publicly was Dr. Tony Sale, who would later reconstruct Colossus from scratch using declassified schematics and surviving memory. His decades-long effort proved not only that the machine had existed, but that it had been far ahead of its time. By the time the full story was known, computing had already transformed the world. Yet deep inside every modern microprocessor, every digital network, every encryption algorithm, there was a trace of Bletchley, a shadow of the logic once encoded in Colossus. The ghosts of Bletchley didn't vanish. They lived on in the circuitry of history itself, silent witnesses to a revolution that began under blackout curtains and ended in the glowing screens of the modern world. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, yet the work of the men and women at Bletchley Park continued in silence. Among them, Alan Turing lingered not in the shadows of secrecy, but in the forefront of imagination. While Colossus had proven the power of electronic computation for cryptanalysis, Turing's mind raced toward something far more ambitious, a machine that could think. In the quiet halls of the National Physical Laboratory, Turing began formalizing his ideas for the Automatic Computing Engine (ACE). Unlike Colossus, which had been purpose-built to break Lorenz ciphers, ACE was designed to perform general calculations, store data, and execute instructions in sequence, the blueprint for a modern digital computer. Turing meticulously drafted schematics showing memory units, arithmetic logic sections, and control mechanisms, anticipating techniques that would only become standard decades later. Turing also explored the concept of artificial intelligence. In his seminal 1947 lecture, he posed questions that seemed almost science fiction. Could a machine learn from experience? Could it adapt to new problems without explicit programming? He devised the Turing test, a theoretical framework to measure whether a machine could exhibit behavior indistinguishable from a human. At the time, his peers largely dismissed the ideas as speculative, even fantastical. Meanwhile, Turing's work was constrained by government secrecy. Much of what he envisioned had been entwined with wartime cryptography, classified under the Official Secrets Act. Proposals for funding and collaboration were either rejected or delayed because authorities feared revealing methods derived from Bletchley Park. Yet Turing persisted, driven by a vision of machines that could extend human reasoning and calculation beyond natural limit. In parallel, American engineers were developing ENIAC and later UNIVAC, systems that could execute instructions electronically and perform thousands of calculations per second. Turing's ACE, though slower to materialize due to bureaucratic obstacles, contained ideas more advanced than many contemporaneous systems, including early concepts of stored program architecture, which became central to modern computing. Turing's notes reveal his fascination with feedback loops, learning algorithms, and adaptive machines. He speculated that, given enough memory and processing capability, a machine might autonomously solve problems, recognize patterns, and even generate its own hypotheses. These concepts laid the philosophical and practical groundwork for machine learning and artificial intelligence decades later. Despite technical brilliance, Turing faced personal and professional isolation. He struggled with the dual burden of secrecy and the disbelief of colleagues. Nonetheless, his ACE proposal remained a rigorous blueprint detailing memory registers, instruction sets, and processing cycles in unparalleled precision. Every line of his notes reflected an engineer and a visionary, balancing theoretical purity with practical design. Turing's work at this stage demonstrated a rare synthesis: the pragmatism of a wartime engineer and the foresight of a futurist. While the world would celebrate the American ENIAC as the first operational electronic computer, Turing's ACE offered a vision of computation as a universal tool capable of transcending cryptography to address mathematics, science, and, eventually, intelligence itself. The significance of Turing's hidden vision extends beyond technical innovation. It represents the birth of conceptual computing, a shift from machines as mere calculators to machines as agents capable of complex reasoning. In the minds of a few, the digital age was already emerging, invisible, classified, but inevitable. After the end of World War II, the immense effort at Bletchley Park was gradually dismantled. Colossus machines, which had once thundered through Lorenz encrypted messages, were dismantled under strict secrecy. Yet, the intellectual legacy they left behind would quietly ignite Britain's post-war computing revolution. Engineers, mathematicians, and codebreakers, many of whom had worked on Colossus, carried forward their expertise to civilian applications. Among them was Maurice Wilkes, who in 1949 designed the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, EDSAC, at the University of Cambridge. Unlike Colossus, EDSAC was built for general-purpose computation, storing programs in memory and capable of executing complex calculations autonomously. It became one of the first operational stored program computers in the world. The shift from cryptography to civilian computation involved a series of technical innovations. Memory storage transitioned from punch tapes and delay lines to mercury-based delay tubes and, eventually, magnetic storage. Input and output systems evolved from teletype machines to cathode ray displays and paper tape readers. These developments reflected lessons learned at Bletchley Park. Precision, reliability, and speed under pressure were non-negotiable. During the same period, British companies began exploring commercial computing opportunities. Ferranti, for instance, collaborated with Cambridge to produce the Ferranti Mark I, a derivative of EDSAC, which became the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer in 1951. The machine incorporated innovations in arithmetic logic units, control flow, and input-output systems that directly stemmed from wartime experience. The intellectual migration from military secrecy to public knowledge was gradual and cautious. Many wartime engineers remained bound by the Official Secrets Act, delaying the widespread dissemination of computing method. Nevertheless, academic papers, technical reports, and lectures slowly introduced ideas such as stored program architecture, subroutine implementation, and electronic logic design. These concepts became the foundation of modern computer science curricula. The British computing ecosystem, while less aggressively commercial than the emerging American landscape, fostered methodical innovation and rigorous engineering. Colossus' legacy, speed, accuracy, and programmability, manifested in both experimental machines and early software development. Codebreakers trained during the war were uniquely skilled at debugging, algorithmic thinking, and systems integration, making them pioneers in the post-war computing industry. By the mid-1950s, Britain had established a quiet yet formidable computing presence. Universities, government laboratories, and companies were all contributing to the growing body of knowledge. The ACE and EDSAC projects inspired modular design, memory management techniques, and early programming languages, bridging the gap between cryptographic necessity and civilian technology. The story of Britain's quiet computing revolution demonstrates the continuity between wartime innovation and peacetime application. What had begun as a classified effort to decode enemy communications became the backbone of modern information technology, influencing both hardware and conceptual frameworks for decades to come. With the hardware foundations laid by Colossus, EDSAC, and Ferranti Mark I, the next challenge was software. The transition from hardware-driven calculation to programmable machines required a completely new way of thinking. Early programmers, many of them former codebreakers, were tasked with translating complex wartime logic into sequences a machine could execute. One of the first breakthroughs was the development of assembly language for EDSAC, which allowed programmers to write instructions symbolically rather than in raw binary. This made programming more accessible and reduced errors that could crash the fragile early machines. David Wheeler, a former Bletchley analyst, introduced subroutine libraries that allowed repeated operations to be reused without rewriting entire sequences, an innovation inspired by the repetitive nature of cryptanalysis. During this period, programming was painstakingly manual. Instructions were fed into machines using paper tape, and every program required precise planning before execution. A single misplaced symbol could halt the machine for hours, or worse, destroy a computation mid-process. Despite these challenges, early programmers created software that could solve mathematical problems, simulate physical processes, and even manage basic business computations, laying the groundwork for modern software engineering. Bletchley-trained personnel applied their pattern recognition and problem-solving skills from codebreaking to debugging early programs. They understood the importance of logical structures, error checking, and algorithm optimization, concepts that would later become essential in computer science education. These practices formed the first professional standards for software development, blending mathematical rigor with practical engineering. Meanwhile, knowledge of computing slowly spread beyond Cambridge and Ferranti. Universities across Britain began teaching programming and machine operations, using machines like EDSAC as practical teaching tools. Students learned binary arithmetic, control flow, and memory management, skills directly descended from wartime experience. The principles of secure communication and data processing from Bletchley influenced early notions of computer security, highlighting a clear line from cryptography to software architecture. By the early 1950s, the concept of a stored program computer was no longer theoretical. Early software projects tackled increasingly complex tasks: numerical weather prediction, artillery calculations, and economic modeling. These applications mirrored the dual focus of wartime codebreaking: speed and accuracy under pressure. Former codebreakers, now programmers, were instrumental in transforming these machines into practical tools for science, government, and industry. The legacy of Bletchley Park's Colossus and the early computing pioneers extended far beyond hardware. Programming became an intellectual discipline in its own right, emphasizing logical reasoning, structured coding, and systematic problem-solving. This foundation directly influenced the development of high-level programming languages in the late 1950s and 1960s, bridging wartime cryptographic ingenuity with the emerging software-driven age. In essence, the secret codebreakers of World War II had unintentionally created the first generation of software engineers. Their work demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and rigorous methodology could transform abstract concepts into functional, world-changing technology. By the mid-1950s, the influence of Bletchley Park's Colossus and its pioneering programmers extended far beyond the walls of secret bunkers. The lessons learned from wartime codebreaking, precision, logical rigor, and rapid problem-solving, were now being applied to civilian and military computing alike. Machines that had once decrypted enemy messages were now being repurposed for scientific calculations, cryptography, and industrial applications, marking the dawn of the modern computing era. British engineers and mathematicians, many of whom had been involved in Colossus or EDSAC projects, began collaborating internationally. The United States, inspired by both the British Colossus and ENIAC, accelerated its own computer programs. Early mainframes, such as UNIVAC I and IBM 701, incorporated concepts developed during the war: stored program architecture, electronic switching, and high-speed computation. The transition from military secrecy to public application was not instantaneous. Many Colossus veterans were initially barred from discussing their work due to security classification, meaning that much of their knowledge entered academia and industry slowly, piece by piece. Nevertheless, the foundations they laid were critical. Universities began offering computer science courses, research labs experimented with numerical simulations, and governments invested heavily in computing infrastructure for both defense and administration. The cultural impact was equally profound. Programming became recognized as a profession, with early software developers adopting structured techniques for debugging and algorithm design. The patterns and approaches first tested in cryptanalysis and in the operation of Colossus shaped modern programming logic, error checking, and modular design, creating a lineage from secret wartime projects to everyday technology. By the 1960s, the vision of a world connected and powered by computers began to take shape. concepts like automated data processing, real-time calculation, and secure communications traced directly back to Colossus and the ingenuity of Bletchley Park's personnel. The cryptanalysts, mathematicians, and engineers who had once worked in secrecy had effectively invented the blueprint for modern computing, even if public recognition came decades later. Looking back, it is clear that the legacy of these early computing pioneers was not just technological, it was intellectual and organizational. The emphasis on structured thinking, problem decomposition, and systematic testing informed generations of scientists and engineers. Colossus, EDSAC, and the early programmers became the invisible architects of the digital age, proving that wartime necessity could accelerate innovation beyond imagination. The story of Bletchley Park and the birth of the first computers is a testament to human ingenuity, demonstrating that knowledge, precision, and creativity under pressure can reshape history. From decoding Enigma to establishing the foundations of modern computing, these pioneers transformed secret operations into a legacy that continues to influence technology, science, and society today.